Welcome back to Clark County Today. We're continuing a story with David Hedrick. We just went through all the domestic violence walk that you went through, and now we want to find out, well, David, you still care about this country, you still care about this community, and maybe you can share a little bit about some of your convictions.
Sure. Well, I believe in the Constitution. I believe in the founding of our nation. I think our founders were onto something, and they decided for the first time in human history that governments don't dictate to their people, people dictate to their government. And I think that's an amazing thing. It's something, unfortunately, as a nation, we've been moving away from. We've been moving towards much more centralized government that tells us, everything from when we, in some communities, when we can run our lawn sprinklers to, how we're gonna, raise our own kids in our own home. And when you look at these restrictions and things government's doing, telling us what to eat and everything else, where they're essentially turning into nanny-controlled government. And that's not what our founders envisioned. They envisioned citizens that control their own lives, that control their own families, and they tell the government what to do rather than that, the direction that it had always been before.
Yes, and the Tea Party is very much about teaching the Constitution, teaching the principles behind the Constitution. The amendments to the Constitution, were they meant to restrain what states or people can do, or meant to restrain what federal government can do?
They were meant to control the federal government. And I think the 10th Amendment is quite clear. The 10th Amendment talks about essentially that all powers not granted to the federal government are given to the states or to the people. And it's very clear that that's where the power of the nation resides. It was intended to be a limit on federal power. It wasn't intended to be any kind of limit on individual things. And the founders weren't even saying that all rights are contained in the Constitution, and or I should say the Bill of Rights. And some of the founding fathers were actually quite concerned when they made the Bill of Rights, and they worried that someday someone was going to say, those are your rights and that's it. That's all the rights you have. And they didn't even want a Bill of Rights because of that, because they didn't want that suggestion made. But I think that they were quite clear, the founders in all their writings, saying that no, these aren't all of your rights. Your rights are given from God. You have the right to be free, and that includes a lot of things. And this is just saying that we're recognizing some of these exist, and we're officially recognizing their existence, and saying federal government cannot touch them. But it's not putting any limit on them.
The founders, if they had a greatest fear, what would it be?
I think the greatest fear is that government would control the people. And you look at George Washington, and this is, he's an amazing guy. And, you think about every person throughout history that had a position of power took over, and they became all powerful. Napoleon hated emperors until he called himself Emperor Napoleon. And this had happened over and over again throughout history, where a dictator would come in, say he was going to help the people, and end up making himself what he truly was the whole time, which was a dictator. And for the first time in history, a man who could have taken over, could have become a king, had an army behind him, an unhappy army who hadn't been paid behind him, and he walked away from power. And I think that's what our founders wanted for us, and they were worried that someone would, at some point, would do the opposite. Someone would say that, no, I want power over my neighbor. I want to control people. I want to dictate to people because I am, like every leader before me, I know what's best. And I think that was their huge concern. And we need to follow Washington's example. And when you have elected leaders, they need to follow that example, where they step in and they do what they can, and then they step away.
So even though George Washington was a fabulous leader, and it would have been good for the country for him to continue to serve as first president, still he was being pressured at the time to stay in office, actually become like an emperor, become like a king. And he absolutely did not want to have anything to do with that. Is that right?
Nope. He chose to go home for the first time. Now, there's a story about the Greeks, and I don't remember the name of the Greek, but we think it's largely a myth of someone that had done this in the past. And that's how remarkable this is we don't even know if it's a true story when there's a report of this actually happening before. It's an American story. We're the first ones that actually did that and made it work. And, it was the idea of liberty, the idea of, this enlightenment that came into play, where we recognize that, individuals are sovereign over their own lives, and that it's not up to government to tell them how to live their lives.
So that was novel back then.
It was absolutely novel. It was brave. I mean, it was something that hadn't been tried before, and I'm sure that a lot of people told them, you're absolutely crazy, this can't work. And yet it made us the most prosperous nation in the history of the world.
It is quite amazing how the United States has grown and prospered since then. Those principles had great blessings. That in the Constitution is so simple, it's so short, it's so specific, it just restrains federal government. How faithfully have we stayed true to that Constitution over the years? If you look at what we're doing now, How are we doing?
We're not. We're we're way off of what the Constitution, what it means. And
when did that happen? When did we branch away from the roots?
It's been happening for a while, but it started largely in the progressive era, the 1930s, when we had a lot of the progressive, the New Deal type stuff. I call it the bum deal. It's really kind of where we got into this mentality of government takes care of the citizens instead of citizens taking care of themselves.
So the progressive era, is that the definition of it?
That's what now I think there's, I've heard it called that. I don't know if there's official definition for it, but that's kind of, I look at the progressives really starting to take over where they turned the tide in the 1930s. And, with the Reagan Revolution, we had some turn back, where we've, fought against them. But they've steadily been increasing government power, increasing federal authority, increasing taxes, increasing federal debt. These things have been constant throughout time. If you plot it, we've had some pullbacks, but it's going to go straight up. And we're seeing that government is controlling us rather than us controlling government. And now they laugh at the Constitution. I mean, you look at Nancy Pelosi and some of the elected leaders of Congress, where they've been interviewed and they've acted like it's a joke. Like, you really expect us to abide by that? Well, you swore an oath when you took office, and you raised your right hand, you put one hand on a Bible, and you said, you're swearing before God and before all the citizens in this country that you're going to abide by that Constitution, and that to your best you're going to execute, the laws that reflect the values and what that Constitution means.
Well, progressives, that's a good word. Sounds good. I want progress. We'll we'll just progress into the future. Sounds really good, but you can't look by the book of the cover on the book. You need to be able to figure out what it really means. So is the living Constitution, what does that mean to you?
Well, the living Constitution is for people that don't believe in a Constitution, and that's essentially what it is. Our founding fathers, the reason they put it in writing is because they didn't want a living Constitution. And if the living Constitution made the federal government all powerful, they could have just wrote the federal government's all powerful and went home. And they wouldn't have had to stay, in the hot and the heat and deal with the bugs and everything else they had to deal with when writing it. They could have just simply went back to their farms. But they stayed there and they wrote that document and they went through all the pains of restricting the power of the federal government with the intent of having something that was set, something that was solid, something that future generations, they couldn't just corrupt it and say, well, it really meant this. This is what they really wanted. They wanted to say, no, this is what we meant.
So it was straightforward enough. It meant what it said, and it said what it meant, and it's supposed to speak for itself, and you don't have to interpolate to make it say something else.
That's what they wanted.
Mean something else. That's
the best way, and I believe it was Thomas Jefferson that said, bind them down with the chains of the Constitution. And he understood that that's what it was. It was chains on the federal government. That's what it's supposed to be. And chains aren't living and breathing. They're going to hold you in place, and that's the idea. And that's exactly what the founders wanted, and that's exactly what we need to move back towards. And people that talk about living, breathing, well, okay, well then your rights are living and breathing too. And for those of you progressives that like it, well, your right to free speech, I can say, is living and breathing, and maybe I don't like what you said over here. So maybe we can curtail that. I don't think they would like it if we turn the tables like that. And that's what they have to understand, is as soon as you open the Constitution up to being living and breathing, well, then I can say it's whatever I want too. And you might not like the result. And our founders understood that well. And they said that we need to have a fair system where people are free. And freedom is our goal. Liberty is where we're going. And then people can flourish and people can make their own decisions, but this is going to be our bedrock, is the Constitution. Return to it, go back to this. It's a gift, it's a gift from God, I think. When you look at the document and you look at how they came together and all the odds that were against them, I mean, this was, it's a miracle that this happened. And all of these people put together at that perfect moment in time to create this system of government that could sustain us as the greatest nation the world's ever seen. And if we turn away from that we were given, it's a tragedy. It
reminds me that we have to be very careful about these nice sounding terms. Living document it's alive, it's good, and that sounds really good. But it's a substitute that really means something else. It's living document gives them license to make it say whatever they want it to say, instead of being bound down like chains that says you have to do this. It restrains you, not the other way around. Just today we had the credit rating for the United States. It looks like it's being reduced because of the massive debt. And the government trying to do so much that has broken loose from those chains that bind, trying to do everything. And I wonder, where are we going? How close are we to being insolvent? How close are we to a major financial crisis?
And I think we're a lot closer than most people think. And this is something, it's not pretty to say, and you're supposed to sound optimistic about a lot of things. I know people like to hear optimism, but in the financial situation, our nation, we're in trouble. And financially, the amount of money we've been spending, it's impossible to sustain. And our credit rating should have been lowered a long time ago, because it's the credit rating at some point is losing any credibility whatsoever, because we know it can't be true. We don't have the best credit as a nation, and we don't have it because our debts are so out of control that at our current rate of spending, we will never be able to pay them down. We have to stop the spending, because financially, the only other alternative is to print money. Well, if you print money, economics is boring, I know, but that will cause inflation. It will cause everything you buy, a loaf of bread will be $10, and it won't seem as boring then when you have to look at the idea of inflation and what that does. The Weimar Republic tried it in Germany. We see what happened. They were pushing around wheelbarrows of money to buy stuff. I mean, it became ridiculous. They were bleaching money to write on as note paper because it was cheaper than buying note paper. It's, you can't just inflate a currency indefinitely. Even if you're the reserve currency of the world, there's a breaking point, and we're approaching that. And that's something we have to look at. We better get our fiscal house in order, because we've got trouble down the road if we don't.
So if we're not balancing the budget, federal budget each year, that money's being made up somewhere. Is that being made up by printing more money?
It is. Right now, that's what we've been doing. And it's they say it's the last refuge of failed republics is just to print money. And it has never worked in human history. Every single time it's been done, the currency has eventually collapsed or been destroyed. You can't indefinitely just print money out of nothing and just continue on, because people eventually realize that the money isn't worth anything, because you're simply just printing it and making more of it. Well, that doesn't increase the value of anything. You still have the same amount of goods in the country. You still have the same amount of capital. You have the same amount of productive ability. It hasn't actually increased any value. It's just increased the sum of dollars.
So in comparison to the rest of the world, they look at the United States being able to just print money. We're the only ones that can legally counterfeit our own money, turn it into monopoly money. So when we're buying things like oil, and they see us keep printing money, what's that going to do to the price of oil? I filled up today 16 gallons of gas or 15 gallons of gas ended up being $60-some. And if almost approaching $4 a gallon, people are saying that the price of oil, it's not the price of oil is going up, it's that the value of the dollar is going down.
Right.
So it's going to take more dollars to buy that same amount of oil.
It is, absolutely.
So, go ahead.
And it's going to, when you think about the effects of that too, just around the nation, around the world right now, people are starting to question the dollar. And there's all kinds of talks in all different groups about, getting off the dollar and going on to something that's more, it's based on something.
If that happens, what will that do to the price of gasoline at the pump?
It potentially, it would skyrocket. It could be devastating for our entire economy if that happened. Right now, we've benefited a lot from the fact that we have this dollar that's worth so much. And over time, we've continued to do everything in our power to destroy that. And it's something we're going to have to stop.
So we as a nation have been very resilient. We've been have a great history. We're facing a crisis right now, but we want to be optimistic. We want to be hopeful for the future. What can be done? What really needs to be done in order for us to have a bright future? In order to get us back on the right track, what do we need to do?
Well, one is citizens need to be active in their government. And for a long time, and I was this way for a while, where I would, I'd watch Fox News and I'd pay attention and watch the History Channel and read the articles and you think, because you become educated and informed, but I was disillusioned with the process. I saw when George Bush was in office that, even though I liked some of the things he was doing, a lot of them, he was taking us in the wrong direction. He was spending out of control. He was doing all the things the Democrats were doing. And I had personally put a lot of time into fighting to get him in office. And I saw that I was completely disillusioned and tired and thinking, well, if I fight for someone to be in office and they turn around and they do the opposite of what I thought they stood for, then what do I do? And I wanted to just throw my hands up and go home. But we can't do that. As citizens in a country, if we hope to remain free and we hope for our children to remain free, we have to get out there and be on the front line. We have to be willing to, go to those community meetings, show up at the town hall, whether it's a Republican or a Democrat, show up at that town hall and make your voice heard. And if you believe, read the Constitution, read the founding writings, find out why are we in the situation we're in? Why were we the greatest country in the world? How did we get here?
So relearn the history, relearn those principles, and I guess the Tea Party is one of those ways to do that.
Absolutely.
I've attended a number of Tea Parties, and I was so encouraged to see my friends and neighbors there learning the Constitution, taking a part in this, and that to me is just really encouraging, because in order to get us back on track, we need to learn what made us great and successful in the first place. We got a break here, so we'll wrap this up. We'll start again in a minute.